Okay, so in today's lab, we're going to build on the work that we did in the previous labs, and we're going to do a little more with selecting and records, sorting them, filtering, and using wildcards. We're going to be working with campaign contribution data to the 2018 Maryland gubernatorial candidates, Larry Hogan and Ben Jealous. We're going to build on that today, and we're going to learn how to do some pretty interesting things by calculating totals, calculating summary statistics from our data, and learning how to use the group by statement to essentially do versions of pivot tables that we did in Excel, but do it in SQL. So we're going to walk through that starting now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save this so that we can submit the assignment at the end as 11 in class lab. You should replace your first name and last name. And save that to the desktop for now. Okay, and then we're going to put a comment up at the top with name and date. So Sean Mussenden. And today is 9/28. And then below that, we'll explain what this means later, but we are going to do something called set SQL mode fold group by. This is just a setting, and I'll explain this in a little more detail later, but it's a good idea to have this at the top of your file when you're going to be doing any kind of group by calculation. So I typically put this at the top of any SQL file that I'm working with. Okay, and then we actually need to execute that, so I'm just going to highlight it, and I'm going to run it. So that's been set. Okay, next thing up, we're going to talk about how to calculate totals from our data, which is to tell us what the total of all campaign contributions to all candidates were, or what the average campaign contribution was, or what the minimum or the maximum was. But just as a reminder, I want to reacquaint ourselves with the data. So I'm going to put a comment saying, just taking a look at the full record set. So select star, select all fields from the table exercises, MD race in exercises. Okay, so again, we have 55,000 records. We've got about a dozen fields detailing contributions to Larry Hogan and Ben Jealous. Each one is a record, and there's some information about who gave it, and in some cases who they worked for, how much they gave. Okay, so SQL has several functions for generating summary totals from a group of records. So I'm just going to paste in here so we can talk about them. They're also in the repo. So here are some of the different functions we can use. So sum gives us the total. This probably looks similar to Excel. Average, calculate the mean. We can also do the minimum or maximum value in a single column. We can also count, so trying to get a sense of the number of records. Let's do an example of this. So we are going to sum. So I'm going to write a query that totals up all of the contributions to all of the candidates. It's actually all of the reported contributions. In some cases, they don't always have to report everything of a certain dollar amount, but it's everything that's in our data here. So here's the query. So select sum. So there's the function sum, and then the argument here, or the thing that we want to calculate the sum on, is the contribution amount. So there's the contribution amount. And then we're using from exercises.md.govrace. So I'm going to run that. So we get a single table, which is 116,386,619, sum of contribution amount. And often what I'm doing when I'm sort of querying the data is to just put in the answer that I get as part of the result as I'm going through. This is a data diary, or a kind of way of keeping notes and showing my work at the same time. So you can right click here and you can copy the row unquoted, and then I'll just make this pretty by putting in some commas, or 16.4 million. Okay. So one thing to note, this this column name is a little bit unwieldy, and I know there's only one record that's returned here, but when we're actually building tables that might have lots of rows and lots of fields with summary data, it can be nice to get a more sort of natural language column name. And so I just want to talk about a new operator called as, which allows us to sort of rename columns. So I'm going to do this saying same query as above, but with a new friendlier column name. Okay, so that's what this looks like. So select sum, contribution amount, same as before, but I put this as operator here, so as contribution total, so that's what the new column will be named, from exercises.md.govrace. So when we run that, we get the same thing, we just get a slightly prettier column name here. Okay, so the other summary statistic functions sort of work the same way, so we'll just do a couple of those together. So this is the way you calculate the average contribution. So it's going to look really similar, but the only difference is select average, ABG, contribution amount as average underscore contribution from exercises.md.govrace. And the average contribution is just under $300, or 296.2, or 1.8 actually. Okay. We can also select the min and max. These were functions we didn't necessarily use in Excel, but this can be a good sense of getting a sense of the shape of your data. So this would be the minimum contribution, and let's run that. So the minimum one is actually 0. There may be a little bit of dirtiness in this data, so this can help you get a sense of that. It would be strange for someone to have contributed no money in a contribution. It's possible that's an error. And then the max contribution is sort of the same. We can see what the largest one is, and that was 68,133. So it might be useful to go look up that contribution and see what it is, and we'll do that later. Okay. So we can also do count here. As a summary statistic, so I'm going to go ahead and count the number of records. So count star, this is a way to count the number of rows as number contributions from exercises.md.govrace. So let's take a look at that. We get 555,327. Okay. I want to talk for a second about count. So if you use it in conjunction with the name of a single field. So if we were, for example, to put in here like contribution type or employer occupation or something similar here, instead of using star, what it's going to count is the number of non-null values for that particular field. So if what you're expecting to get using count is the number of records, then you want to use star. If you want to get a count of the number of non-null values in a particular field, you would plug in that particular field. So I just want to show an example of how that might be a little bit, you'll get a different result using a field name versus star. Okay, so just as a reminder, when we did count stars, number contributions from exercises.md.gov rates, we got 55327. This time we're going to pull in the employer name, which if you go back to our sort of introductory query we used just to look at the whole table, we noticed there was a lot of null values in there. So when I run that, I get a different number. I get 19201. So you just want to be really careful to make sure to use count star if what you're trying to get is the number of records in a given table. If what you are actually trying to get is something more specific, the number of non-blank or non-null values, then you would want to use a column name. So let's run that again. Good. So it's also possible to combine several of these summary statistic calculations into one single query, which will give us sort of a nice little output table. And I typically do something like this when I am trying to understand the shape of a particular database. I will often, the first thing I'll do when I sit down is do what you're about to see on most fields to try and get a sense of what might be in there. I'll also do group bys, which we'll get to in a minute. But I'm going to put in a query to say, let's generate a summary table for contributions. And we're going to put in contribution amount.
Oh!
Okay, let's go ahead and paste that in. Okay, so let's look at what we have here. We've got a select statement, and then just like our sum calculation above, we have sum contribution amount as contribution total. But instead of going to from, we're now going to the next column. So now we're calculating the average contribution amount as average contribution, comma, then the min, then the max, and then count star, which gives us the number of records from this table. So let's run that. All right, so now we get a column with contribution total, the average contribution, the smallest contribution, the largest contribution, and the number of contributions. Okay, so the previous queries that we've done, we're all calculating summary statistics on every single record in the database, so all 55,000-ish contributions. But we can also combine these summary statistic calculations with other things we've learned in SQL, like filtering out a set of records and then calculating summary statistics just for that. So we're going to do that. And in this case, what I'm trying to do is return a summary table, just like the one we have here. But I don't want it for everybody. I just want it for contributions to Larry Hogan. So I'm just going to put a new comment. So comments, summary table for contributions to Larry Hogan only. Okay. So we've got the same exact query as above. Okay. But this time I'm going to throw in one little wrinkle. So I've got my selecting all of the individual columns I want to create for sum, average, min, max, and count from exercises.mdgovrace. But now I'm going to throw in a where clause. So my where clause is going to be where the receiving committee, and that's, if you remember, then basically the way you figure out the name of the candidate, where the receiving committee is like Hogan. So as a reminder, this means if the word Hogan appears anywhere in that committee name, it's going to show up. So if there's anything on this side or anything on that side. Okay, so when I run that, now I get different totals than I had before. So a total of 14 million in contributions. Average contribution close to 400 bucks, which was higher than the average for both candidates. Smallest contribution is $1. Largest contribution is 68133. So now we know that largest contribution we identified before went to Hogan. And the number of contributors, so 35,000 out of roughly 55,000. Okay, so that's handy. But now suppose that we wanted to generate one of these for Ben Jealous as well. But we didn't want to have to write two queries, and we actually wanted them in the same table where we can compare them pretty easily. So one way we can do that is to introduce a new type of statement, the group by statement. So this is remarkably similar to this technique we're about to show you to pivot tables that we did in Excel. So pivot tables sort of grouped records on a common field. We're going to do the same thing here. So summary table for contributions to both Larry Hogan and Ben Jealous. Okay. And then we're going to paste in our query from above. So again, we're selecting the sum. Contribution amount is contribution total. The average, the min, the max, the count from this table. But instead of our where clause, I'm going to get rid of that because we want to look at all records. We're going to use something called group by. And this is the thing that is kind of the equivalent of the pivot table. So group by. And then we need to group by a field. And in this case, we want to create one summary record for each candidate. So we're going to group by receiving committee. And I'm going to run that. Okay. So now we have these two records here, contribution, average contribution, smallest, largest number. We don't know which one is which. Okay. So the reason is that we actually need to add that column that we're grouping by to the front of our select statement. So the first column we're going to have is going to be called receiving committee. That's the first one we're selecting. And then sum of contribution amount, and so on and so on. So now we get this nice little receiving committee. So now we know that Larry Hogan got 14 million, whereas Jealous got 2.2 million. Average contribution for Hogan was much, much higher. Jealous got a big contribution, and you may have looked at that in your homework last night. Hogan had a lot more total contributions than Jealous did. So a nice way of comparing the two. Okay, so we can also use where clauses in conjunction with this group by statement to filter out or limit the number of records we're looking at before we do the group by. So there's contributions in this database going back several years, but let's suppose we only wanted to look at contribution to the candidates that happened in 2018. So just like above, we're going to do a summary table for only 2018 contributions to Larry Hogan and Ben Jealous. Okay. So just like above, we'll have a select statement where it's going to give us our receiving committee, all of the summary columns we want to generate from that table. But this time we're going to throw in a where clause. We're going to use a new element, a new function, so year. So what this function does, so year, and the argument is the contribution date. So what that does is it strips out the year from a date. And we've set that equal to 2018. And now we're going to group by the receiving committee. So remember, the number for Hogan was 14 million-ish. The number for Jealous was 2 million-ish. When I run this query now, it should be smaller. These are only 2018 contributions. And we get 2.2 million for Hogan and 1.1 million for Jealous. So again, we're selecting the committee name, all of the summary columns from our exercises table. We're using a where clause this time to limit it only to 2018 records. And then we're grouping by receiving committee, which gives us these two lines here. One thing we haven't done yet is order by, so we can also take the results of this table and sort. So let's say that we wanted to figure out which candidate had the highest average contribution in 2018. And imagine we had a table that had, dozens of candidates. For 2, you can sort of easily just see it, but just imagine you had more candidates. We can throw in an order by statement here to order by average contribution descending. All right. And remember, descending, if we get rid of that, it'll sort the other way by default. So now we get Jealous on top, sorted by average contribution. So you can also do a group by on multiple fields. So let's say instead of just looking at the totals for the 2 candidates in 2018, let's say we wanted to get a breakdown of all of these summary statistics for each candidate in each of the years for which they have contributions. So let's take a look at what that query would look like. It's going to look very similar to what we had above. So we're going to say summary table for all contributions to Hogan and Jealous, broken down by candidate by year. Okay, so in this case we have select the receiving committee. We're also creating a new column which takes the year from the contribution date field, strips it out, and calls it contribution year. Then all of our summary statistics. Then exercises.mdgoverrace, we're taking it from there. And this time, instead of just grouping by receiving committee, we're also grouping by contribution year. And then we're going to order the table by the average contribution. So maybe we want to look at how average contributions have changed kind of over the year. Let's run that. Okay. So we get one record now for Larry Hogan for 2014, for 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. And we get one record for Ben Jealous for 17 and 18. 17 is when he got in the race. That's why he doesn't have contributions before them. It's sorted by the average contribution. So we've selected the receiving committee, the year of the contribution date, all of our summary statistics. We're taking it from the exercises table. We're grouping by receiving committee, and we're grouping by contribution year, which is why we see one row per combination of receiving committee and contribution year. And then we're sorting it by average contribution from highest to lowest. One note about at the top of our file, I had you put this set SQL mode only full group by. If you don't do this, depending on particular attributes of your data, there may be times when you get incorrect answers because of it. It's possible that this is turned on by default in your system, but just to be safe, I always recommend putting it at the top of your file and executing it the first time. Okay, so if you refer back to the assignment on the GitHub repo, it's your turn. So I'd like you to think of some questions that you can ask of the data and write 4 queries that include the following: a select statement, an order by statement, and a group by statement that groups on one or more fields, and calculate some summary statistics. And then 2 out of your 4, so 2 of the 4 should also include a where clause to filter, one of which includes a wildcard. And then you should also have a group by statement that groups by 2 or more fields like we have here. Okay, good luck.